Yeah, thanks for joining this mini course about using Lead-DBS, and maybe just a few words. This is essentially guarded towards people that have already used Lead-DBS quite a bit, have localized electrodes and so on, and it has the aim to just give you some more tools in your repertoire to really make sure, is what I'm seeing in the 3D viewer really correct? So, and I'd say, for beginners, it often is my advice to just, localize 20 patients or so, and don't worry in the beginning too much about, is it even correct what I'm seeing? So obviously, then you shouldn't use any of these results for clinical decisions. We shouldn't do that anyways, but also not for research. Then usually what happens after 20 patients that somebody localizes, they realize, oh, okay, now I get the hang of it, and now I go back to the first ones I did, maybe where I didn't do things perfectly right. Now this again is really more for people that already know this and have been at that stage. That being said, maybe just a few resources. So first of all, everybody should know that there are, resources on the Lead-DBS website. For example, of course, there's our Slack user channel that is quite active where you can ask questions. But there's also this knowledge base here. And for example, we have walkthrough videos here that are good for the beginning. And then we've just updated it. So Nanditha Rajamani also has one converting to the BIDS standard and so on. And then the book we published is kind of a walkthrough or like a handbook to Lead-DBS as well. So especially the beginning of it has, chapters on each of the, processing steps and so on. The other thing I want to say is that today, unfortunately, I won't be working in the BIDS format already. We're just in the process of, switching to BIDS. But I figured at this point, I am myself not confident enough yet to show you the same thing in BIDS. And there might still be bugs and so on. So we will work on the legacy branch, but what I'm going to show you is really universal. So it's more about, essentially using 3D Slicer and other viewing tools to be sure, what you're seeing is correct. Because that's a question I often get, how do I trust Lead-DBS? And just to show it for you, this is an example BIDS subject, which as normal has, the raw data. There's only one subject in this repository here, and then also has derivatives Lead-DBS sub 1, and then it will be way more logical. For example, the co-registration will be essentially the outputs from this co-registration step, and then the head model is not so important, but the normalization would be this one, and then there's brain shift corrections on. So the team in Berlin essentially made a great deal of moving this into BIDS. And what I'm going to show you here now still going to be the old version that is less standardized. But I think everything you're going to see in this video is going to, or in this course, is going to be directly applicable to the BIDS as well. So then also please feel free to ask questions, but maybe only if they're quite urgent or really to that topic. We can of course also have a discussion later. And I planned around 2 hours for this, but we will see how it goes. We can also, at any point make a break, and maybe we'll be much quicker than 2 hours as well. So I haven't, I have no slides. This is really freestyle, showing you what we have. All right, so to briefly recap, most of you know, and that's one thing I also wanted to show, because not everybody knows that we can start, of course, with a preoperative image like a T1, and that's also the first small tip I want to give, especially to Mac users. This pressing space and showing a quick view of an IFTI file is really handy if you work with Lead-DBS. and that is made possible by the DTI-TK Quick Look plugin. We'll link to that in the video as well. So if you haven't gotten that installed, it's really helpful because you can flick through, the images popping up. I have that in my other walkthrough videos, and I've heard that some people that have seen it don't know what I'm doing. So I want to explain, this is the DTI Quick Look plugin, DTI-TK, and it's really handy and helpful. But yeah, so we use preoperative and postoperative images as the minimal inputs to Lead-DBS, right? So we have the post-op CT, which in this view can't be previewed because it's quite high resolve. That's why it's so red here. But this is really just the CT with the electrodes, as you may know it. And then we have the pre-op images, and that might for some people not even be clear, and that's a crucial point. You can and you should add in not only just the T1, but if you have more images than just the T1, add all of them in, right? So a T2, for example, if it's an STN-DBS surgery, really informative. If you have, F-Gadia or something like that, please put all of them in there, but only the volumes with good enough resolution. So you shouldn't put anything in here, let's say, that has a slice thickness of 6 millimeters or even 4 millimeters, right? So it should be around at least 2 millimeters slice thickness, which is the case, for example, in my case, in the T2, we have a high in-plane resolution of 0.65 millimeters, and then a slice thickness of 2 millimeters, right? But put these in there. We've shown in the UART paper in 2019 in Neuroimage that it really helps the accuracy of the segmentations. So that might be a first, take home for new users. Multispectral, use as much imaging data as you have and not just the T1. Okay, now if we process this, so if we run, we open this subject. This can be done by dragging and dropping it onto Lead-DBS, but also by of course, just selecting it, as many of you've done. And if we now go through, let's say, the standard steps and run and do everything, then we would get a processed directory like that I'm going to work on today, right? So we have assumed we have just run these standard steps out of the box. We have, first imported from DICOM to Nifty, and we have now a processed folder like this, which again has the, the multiple anatomical images. It's a slightly different subject that I've just shown you, but in this case, we have 4 pre-op images. These are now all registered to the anchor modality, which is the T1 by default, and they have been slightly reformatted. So they're not in the very original orientation anymore, and they are 0.7 isotropic resolution usually. So that is what Lead-DBS does to assure that we don't lose much data from these images. And now the first thing, so let's assume maybe that a colleague, a good friend of yours, gave you this data set and said, I have trouble with it, I want to check it. I want you to check it. I want to see, have I done everything correctly? Or it's an old data set from 6 months ago and you just want to be sure this is correct, right? This has already been processed, but now the question is this really correct? Am I seeing what I'm supposed to be seeing? And that's what this course is meant to be about. So we have already processed it. And as you can see here, we have 3 processing steps that are marked in green. Probably not a good choice because of the red-green blindness, but that many people have it. But these 3 are essentially the 3 steps where Lead-DBS would require user input, where you can look at things. And then also this retouch and override approved results checkbox is quite hard to understand in the beginning. It essentially just says that if you have it checked, so maybe first of all, if you're unsure, just have it checked always, it doesn't matter, right? So it would just mean that it really will always force to do what you say, right? So if you click normalize and have that on, it will run it no matter what, right? If you had already approved the normalization, it would not, if that is off, right? So this is essentially a tool that can be used for batch processing multiple subjects. But for now, maybe just, don't worry about it, always have it on. And if you now click check results, that's the first of these green steps, right, that we want to look at. And what you see here is really quite important, and I want to walk through the details of this now. So we see the wireframes, the red wireframes are the edges detected from the T1, which is again the anchor modality, is also shown here. And then in the back you see the T2, right? That's the second modality that we used pre-operatively, and you can already see quite well how good these images now align to each other, right? And usually for the co-registration results, it would be okay if they align like this, right? So because usually this is a linear registration between two images of the same brain, so not a different brain. And usually if it fits quite okay-ish. There are exceptions though, if you have, for example, a lot of distortion artifacts in one image or something like that, so nonlinear shifts, then it might be important to check more in detail. For that, we have a few tools. So we have the detail viewer, which is up here, which just opens the T1 in a big view and gives you with the mouse the opportunity to look, see the other modality. So we see the T2 here, we see the T1, and we can really look at, at the border of this square now, does this really fit, right? And we can, I think, with the bigger and smaller keys, make that bigger and smaller just to see the windowing. And then, so these are the commands here. There's also the X key, which will give you this hybrid view where, one image has one color, blue, and the other one has the orange color. And in that, if there were a slight mismatch, we would see what we call ghosting. So we would see, let's say, this gyrus, and then maybe an additional rim of it, like a ghost artifact, if the registration is not precise, right? So in this case, I think we can sign off, but just to show you, because this is really about, getting handle on your data, if you go into the patient folder, the two files will be these two. That's slightly different in bits. But we can now, using just 3D Slicer, for example, also open these two and have an imaging viewer that has much more power, even where we can fade between the two. We can really make sure these are correct, right? So and it might, of course, even be more important to look at that in the area of interest, but I'd say in the step for co-registration, they should just match really well as well, right? But for now, let's assume co-registration, we can often sign off. We don't have to, check each picture that in detail as I've just done it. I'm just showing you this for you to understand where the files are stored and how can you do that. Now, the next one will be exactly the same thing. We still have the anchor modality T1, but then also a proton density image on top of it. Same thing, we can check, we can open it again in the detail viewer and so on. But usually we can sign off. This one here is an F-Gator image, but a weird one, an old one that we, in the very beginning that we scanned at Charite. It's a slab image and also has some weird fading. So it's not an optimal F-Gator scan, but it's still called F-Gator. It even has some contrast agent in there. So it's not an optimal scan. But same thing, you could, go into the detail viewer. You already see here, or I see here quite well that it does fit. So we can sign off. And then the last thing we have in here is a T2 star, which can be quite helpful as well in the subcortical region. And then with that, you can sign off, right? These were now And by the way, you can also, so on the Mac, these get the green tag. So that means they have been approved. If we go back and like disapprove, this would also be seen here as a like not approved image. That's a special thing on the Mac. Okay, so now at this point, we can be quite certain that all of these pre-op images are registered precisely to the anchor modality. Now, once that's done and we run normalization, all of them are being used for the normalization. So now imagine a scenario where you had not approved them. They were not really precisely registered, but you had already run normalization. That would mean that normalization used, you know, mismatched images and tried to get them all together into MNI space. So that's not a good idea, right? So usually, optimally, you want to, like, if you detected a mistake here now, you would need to rerun normalization, right? Lead-DBS even warns you about it. So if you did approve now after normalization, it would say, hey, by the way, you should probably rerun normalization here because you have refined the normalization, the registration between the images. The other thing that's really handy is, let's assume this registration just isn't good, right? We see a mismatch here. Now, what we can do is right here in this image, just refine this this registration. So the T2 star to the T1, and we can try it with SPM, Flirt, FSL, ANTS, RANSFit, and so on, and even some hybrid co-registration options. Right. So in this viewer, you can really, you know, take control of the data and make sure, you know, everything is registered. Okay. Now we're still at co-registration, but this one is special. This one is the post-op image and the pre-op T1, right? Same anchor modality as T1, but we have the post-op CT. And you can see that it's even a tone-mapped CT image. Tone-mapped TP means, in this case, that we try to, you know, fuse the bone window and the soft tissue window of the CT together in one view, with the aim that we can see the skull and you know, the details in the soft tissue in the same view, in the same like intensity window. And that's just for visualization. So this is special because, as you may know, between these two images, it's still the same brain, but the skull was opened. And of course, liquid could have flown out during surgery, and the brain might have shifted. So air could have entered the skull. That's called pneumocephalus, as most of you know. And then the brain could shift non-linearly to the skull. So that would mean the skull says something different as the brain, because they have moved relative to each other. But you still want to fuse the two of them, right? You still want to co-register them. And we do that linearly for good reason. I won't go into detail why, but the reason is really that the electrodes should, of course, stay the same to the brain, right? So, but what you can see here right now already is what I just referred before as ghosting. So we have the rim of the T1 that is shifted relative to the rims of the gyri in the CT. We can also look at that now in the detail viewer. We can press S for the sagittal view, and then maybe the X view for the combined view. And I don't know if you see it, but there is some sort of, you know, so this rim of the gyrus is different as this one as well. So there's some sort of ghosting towards, or shift between the two towards the back of the brain, right? So we have a mismatch between the two images. Now, I said this one is special, and the reason is that we have a dedicated processing step for this exact problem, which is called the brain shift correction step, right? So counterintuitively, if the situation is like that, you can sign off of it. The brain can be slightly mismatched only in the CT to MRI, like in the post-op to pre-op scan, because we will have this additional brain shift correction step afterwards that fixes it. That really only applies to this single one combination of post-op to pre-op, right? So, and then to even complicate it further, it shouldn't be completely off, right? We don't want, you know, let's say the CT to be rotated 90 degrees and say, I don't care about it, we have brain shift correction, but we want it to be either perfectly registered or as good as possible registered, right? We're trying to fit a linear map between the CT and the T1 here, and then we'll have the brain shift refinement later on to fix details, right? But so again, only applies to CT, or like only applies to the post-op to pre-op step. Could also be a post-op MRI. They are okay if they are 99% registered or 95% registered, right? They are not okay if they're 70% registered or off, and they are of course okay if they're 100% precise. So in this case, long story short, we can approve again. We still want to look at this direct combination now together and in 3D slicer, just to make sure, you know, it could be that you know, this is a low resolution CT, old data, but you still want to analyze it because it is potentially, you know, from Tourette's patient that's really rare, or, you know, needs help or whatever, is, yeah, kind of a special case that just needs to be localized for some reason. To do so, you can load these two images again into 3D Slicer or a different viewing platform and look at them together and you know, fade across the two and say, okay, yeah, this looks kind of good. But so when I began, I did that. I looked at the skull mainly and thought, okay, the skull is doing well. Skull on the MRI is often dark, interestingly. So or it depends, of course, on the sequence, but you can say, okay, that's fine. Now, the problem is we're not interested in the skull, we're interested in the tissue. So you want to go into the post-op view, and then there's 3D Slicer even has like a soft tissue window here, which would show you better the actual brain versus cerebrospinal fluid boundaries. So we can't see many more details on the CT usually, but we can at least see the CSF, right? So this is, for example, this cistern is a great way of looking at things, right? So we can have a look, okay, does that really fit? Rather than looking at the skull in the CT, we should really look at the ventricles and so on. So here as well, and you do see some mismatch here, right? So again, this is not yet corrected for brain shift. So we do see quite heavy ghosting actually between the two, right? So we see a movement here if we fade between the two. So that would be of concern if it's not the post op to pre-op, because there we can still fix things with brain shift correction, as you will see later. What we can also see here is that there is really some stuff that has entered the brain. So this is actually, so this is air, and that's why we see this nonlinear shift. We see the probably calcium in the T1 as well. So that is probably this stuff here in the falx. But the air that has entered here, so the black stuff, has shifted the brain to the back, and so that leads to this linear registration not being able to fully grasp it. But again, we signed off of it because we know brain shift correction is going to come and solve things, and we hope at this point we have to make a mental note. Okay, if brain shift correction can't fix it, we should think about what to do. But we'll make that mental note. Okay, Maybe for the sake of this course, we'll skip normalization now and just look at brain shift correction directly because we just talked about it. And then we'll go back to the normalization. So that will come as the last step. You see MATLAB still busy, so it's opening this brain shift correction view. And here you can now see what I meant with that. So on the top, you can see again the T1 in red, so the anchor modality in red. And then we see the postoperative CT in the back of that. And then down here, we see the subcortical refinement afterwards. So, and yeah, it seems like the top is not really matching what we saw before. So this is probably not, has been reprocessed for some other demonstration. But the important thing here is that we want to see that the bottom of this, so the subcortical refinement, is as precise as possible. And I believe that this view really usually gives you a quite good, you know, grasp of that. So it again uses the tone mapped CT, and we can now see, you know, really precise fit to the gyri. And we also up here see that there has been some shift in different directions. So this is the X and Y and Z direction. So the brain has kind of shifted, and with that we can sign off of it. If we weren't happy with it, we can recompute brain shift correction, and we have three options. So what brain shift correction does, maybe we can have a look at that. It's also in the Lead-DBS manual. Is nothing else than another step of linear co-registrations between the images, but it focuses on the subcortex. With that, we have, you know, we get rid of the brain, the skull that, you know, says something different as the brain. Remember, I said that, you know, brain and skull have moved relative to each other. So skull says one story, brain says a different story. We're focusing on the subcortex only, so we ignore the skull, right? We're now really interested just on the brain and the soft tissue. And this primer here exactly gives you an overview. You know, we have the pneumocephalus out here, and then the brain has shifted non-linearly relative to the skull. And now what we do in this subcortical refinement or brain shift correction is we just focus on this box here in the brain and refine that fit between, you know, the post-op CT and the T1, so the anchor modality of the pre-op scan. And now we can even refine that further by using, you know, subcortical masks that have been published elsewhere in the very early days of the Berlin group. You know, using a mask that is really primed at the target regions, and then there's even this really fine mask just around the basal ganglia. Usually that's not a good idea to use, but using the middle mask, so the blue mask here, can be helpful. And that's exactly what you see here. No mask would mean just use the box around it. Coarse mask would mean use the blue mask you see, that's a bit coarser, and then the coarse and fine mask would first do the coarse mask and then the fine mask to really just focus on the basal ganglia. But the last step is usually not helpful because you don't have enough signal to noise in your CT scan to really see the basal ganglia. So I would probably start with either of the two, and usually it doesn't matter which one. So, you know, it is much more important that you see it now has a good fit around like this region here, right? So that's where that's what really matters. Okay. Right, so any questions maybe at this point to the linear registrations that we've talked about? So we've talked about preoperative scans to each other, fusing everything to T1. Then we've talked about the postoperative scans to T1, which are the only case that can be kind of off, because then, you know, brain shift correction would fix the error in the end. Does that make sense, or other questions?
Maybe just a very short question. If it wouldn't work and it would show something rotated or anything like that in the co-registration process, which other modality would you use if you would not use the default modality?
So you mean the co-registration? So good point. So I think what Lucas refers or asks is that, let's assume this is now off. The default here that's used for MRI to MRI is SPM, the SPM co-registration technique. So that's the same one as you can see here. Usually my second go would be ANTS. The only reason we use SPM here is that it's much faster. ANTS is as good and sometimes a bit more robust. Well, I don't even know, but it is, since they are linear techniques, we can combine them quite easily. All of them produce such an affine, co-registration matrix, so all have the exact same output. They have slightly different ways of getting to the solution. But for co-registrations, I'm personally confident you can mix and match them. For normalizations, we shouldn't get to that in a second. So yeah, I would guess ANTS, then sometimes even just hybrid SPM, even if both failed, SPM and ANTS failed, hybrid SPM and ANTS would mean it tries SPM first and, displaces it differently and then uses ANTS. That could still solve it because it would start from a different start for the ANTS run. And then I would probably go to brain split and then in the end, FSL. And the only reason I would use FSL last is, first of all, it is quite slow. And second, it has been implemented in the end by the Luxembourg group, and I don't even know super well if all is perfectly implemented. So that's the only reason I would use FSL last. But they should all be okay, whatever works. Yeah. So, but we can talk about that a bit because this is really the pro course. So what if it doesn't work, right? What you tried everything and it just you can't make it fit. What you would do then is, you have several options. If you're just, if you're lazy and you have enough preoperative images, you just think, it also works without the FGAIR scan, you could also just ignore it and take it out. That's one possibility. But if it's a crucial scan that you want to have in there, like the T2, for example, for SCN, you should have a T2. Then you can manually align them in Slicer and then rerun it again, right? So let's assume our T2 scan just didn't work, and we have tried everything. What Lucas just said, we've gone through everything, it just never works. Then what we can do is to load them up into 3D Slicer, manually register them, and then rerun Lead-DBS normalization again, right? So to do that, you open up 3D Slicer and you take the T1 and then the raw T2, right? In bits, that's going to be slightly different, but it's quite easy to figure it out, right? So we open up these, maybe just to show where they would be in the bits folder. Derivatives, Lead-DBS, they would be in the co-registration. So the T1 would be that. And then the T2 would be in the pre-processing T2, right? So that would be the T2. And then again, the T1 would be this one. So you'd open these two. And in the old language, this is the raw T2, raw and T2. So now we have the two in here, and we want to fuse the, they are not co-registered, right? Because this is the raw file. And we want to now co-register the T2 at least roughly to the T1, right? So what we can do here is to go into the transforms tool, and then create a new linear transform. I just call it T often because I don't care. I want to transform, and then we want to apply this to the raw T2. So down here, you can say this transform is now going to be applied live as we do things to the T2, right? And now, if we, for example, move the PA direction of that transform, we can really move the T2 around relative to the T1, right? So you can see now also how such a matrix works. So it's a great tool to explore these matrices. So currently, all we are really changing is the fourth dimension entry of the y direction, which is y is anterior posterior. Fourth dimension of it, it's a three-dimensional image. It's a fine transform. Fourth dimension meaning because it is essentially a translation maps to a sharing in a fourth dimension. Same thing as if you'd have a three-dimension sharing would map to a translation in a two-dimensional image, but that's a detail. So that's why translation maps to the fourth column here. And then now we can say, okay, that's not really helpful. Let's go down. And again, the idea here is not to make it precisely work, but to put them roughly into space, right? We could imagine that the images look like this, right? And what we're trying to do now is to help ants or whatever, or SPM, to get them better aligned. So they don't have to be perfect, right? They just should be kind of, similar to each other, right? So here, now we are already much better. You can flip between the two. Sometimes helps then to also look at, coronal view. Maybe, okay, some rotation in that direction, which would be in the Y direction. Could also help that maybe, I don't know, slightly down. And that's already good enough, right? So if the goal is not to make it perfect, but really to, here you also see beautiful ghosting again between the two images. So yeah, ghosting goes away. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to embed this transform T that I created into the header of the T2 image, so that it is, we don't change the data of it, we don't reslice the image at all, we just, change the header of the image. And that in Slicer can be done if you go to the data tab, and then you look at the transform hierarchy here, and then you see that currently, the T1 is live mapped by the transform. So if we would move it out, I think we could. Anyways, so if we would move it out, it would not be registered anymore. But if we now right click and say harden transform, that's the Slicer lingo to tell, now embed this. Didn't work. Something's wrong. I think it did it, but because it's not showing anymore. Yeah, it also changed the image. So yeah, usually this would, go down to the other hierarchy. So this means we embed the transform T into the raw image. We don't even need to save the transform, I think. I mean, you can save it if you want, of course. We also don't need the scene. All we need to save now is the revised raw T1. And that should already be placed, replace the original one. Personally, I often, in this case, even replace the original one, because we usually still have the DICOM images. So if we ever wanted to go back, we could. But of course, as you want, you can also keep a backup of the old one, and so on. We can safely say, okay, replace this now. And now the T2 is really more co-registered to the T1. We can, of course, check if that's really true, especially because it was a bit fishy. We see T2 was changed. We see T1. We can now open them again without the transform, of course, and let's see. Yeah, now they look better, right? They look more, more like they just did. right? So before they were more off than that. Now they should, they are kind of good. That's fine. We sign off of slicer and we go back to Lead-DBS exactly, and just recompute the co-registration now, because obviously it was wrong before. Now we have changed the raw file. We can now also look at how well it does if we recompute things. And surprisingly, it worked in our view. Just to be sure, you can also click the refresh view. That means that this picture is being recalculated from the Nifty files. That's sometimes a good thing if you just want to be 100% sure everything's correct. Usually Lead-DBS should update it, but refresh view would recreate this. And that image is produced by the FSL tool called Slicer, so it has nothing to do with 3D Slicer, but it's a different tool of FSL. So okay, so I think with that now we can approve it, but now if you paid attention really carefully, we would need to rerun something following this, and that's the normalization, because now apparently T2 had a mismatch, so we fixed it, but we had calculated the normalization based on a mismatch T2 and T1. So now, of course, that was suboptimal, so we have to rerun that, right? So it would even warn you, as said, right? Normalization had been approved before all preoperative co-registrations were approved. So this would mean, you should rerun normalization. Okay, that's good. That's good. That's good. And that's the CT. Now we move to normalization, which is a very different type of co-registration, right? It's a type of co-registration, which is the overall term of fusing two images, but it is a nonlinear way of doing it. And what we're doing in normalization, spatial normalization, is that we take the patient's image, essentially the images, so all of these pre-op images being used at the same time, they're all co-registered, and we want to map them to a different brain, right? So it's a bit like your brain to my brain, or my brain to your brain. And obviously, every brain's different, so we cannot easily find a linear solution to match all the pixels perfectly together. Instead, we want to use a warp field which says, okay, this pixel should go there, but this pixel should go there, and this pixel should go there, and so on. So it's a nonlinear registration, meaning not the same transform is applied to all the pixels, but a different transform will be applied to nearly all of the pixels. Right. So here now, this view shows you something differently, because the red wires now will not be the anchor modality anymore, but will be the MNI space and the T1 of the MNI space. So the edges detected in the MNI space of the T1 MNI space. And the file you see here is the normalized T1. In the old lingo, it's called GL anat Nifty. And then in the new one, in BIDS, it would be under normalization, obviously, anat, and then here the T1 weighted image that is in space of the MNI space, and so on. Right. So this image is going to be shown here in the old lingo that we are still working on here. It's the GL anat Nifty. So again, we can't quick look this one because it's too big. That's the memory, shows us a red image. But this would be exactly this image here. Right. So now normalization, that's a really crucial step, especially in Lead-DBS. But here we really have to be much more careful. So all of the other things we just signed off, kind of, they looked okay. They're easy to see and so on. But here the details really matter. But what really matters is not how well, let's say, this gyrus up here fits the MNI space, but rather what matters is really what happens down where we're interested in, right? And that is often the subthalamic nucleus, but it can be something different. So your target region of the DBS electrode, that needs to be fit precisely. The rest for many applications doesn't even matter, right? So it often doesn't matter what's up here in the cortex for us. If we look at patient-specific tractography or resting state fMRI with lead connectome, then it matters as well, right? But in the standard case where we're just interested in where the electrode is, we want the fit of this normalization to be precise, exactly where the target region is, and maybe around the target region as well, just to be sure, right? So for the STN-DBS case, we're just really interested in, is the fit of the STN great? And for that, you can imagine this view is not really helpful, right? So it looks okay, but we don't see the STN here at all. So this is really crucial now, right? And again, this is the stuff you should learn once you have localized 20 patients. So it might, if you're a beginner, it might now a bit overwhelm you, but for the pros here, this is really where the money lies, where your scientific results will stand or fall with this, right? So there are several tools to look at this. So there's, for example, the old refined atlas fit image, and that will give you a pop-up window of just the STN fit. Let's look at that right now. Okay, so I apparently used this with the caudate at some point, but the standard view would be the STN view. And for that, Lead-DBS already knows that a good idea would be to use the T2 image, not the T1 image. So at the moment in the big background, what it's doing is it will warp the T2 into MNI space to give us a MNI space version of the T2. So you could also see here in the back that the GLANA T2 file has just emerged, was just processed, and that's exactly that normalized T2 image. Okay, what are we seeing here? It really is similar to what we're seeing here. So again, the wireframes are the MNI space, in this case, defined by the distal atlas, which is very, very, very similar to that. Like, it is based on the MNI space. Essentially, we sat down and manually segmented the T2 STN of the MNI space, and that's essentially exactly the distal atlas. So this is really the MNI space definition of the STN. And then in the backdrop, again, you see the patient's image normalized to MNI space, and we can now have a look at the fit between the two, right? So it might be sometimes really well visible, and you can say, okay, this is good, this is great, I'm happy with it. Of course, you can scroll down here, and go through it in more detail and so on. You could also now here use a different metric like the T2 star, for example, which is also sometimes good for the STN. Often in many acquisitions has a problem of a bigger slice thickness though. Now, obviously, T2 star is mapped to MNI space as well. It just emerged here as a file, as you can see. And, again, slice thickness is not perfect here, but the shape is kind of good and so on. Okay, so this view, one option to look at this. The other option is, as we had before, the detail viewer, which would not give you this atlas view. So I would even think it's probably not great anymore. I wouldn't use it that much anymore, but you can. If you press 2 here, it would mean to also warp the T2 image into MNI space and show that. So T2 image, of course, makes some more sense. And you can even see the STN in these wireframes, kind of, but it's not, it's not perfect. So I think this edge here we've used in the past quite a bit to look at, does this really match? But again, I think while this was, how we did it for years to look at the details, we have better tools now. One was what I just showed you, the refined atlas fit thing, that would, just give you a quick view focused on the STN. And then the other thing was created by Simon Oxenford, who's also on the call, which is called Warp Drive, which essentially opens up 3D Slicer to look at exactly what we're looking at here, but gives you the opportunity to also change things, right? So that is currently hidden here. So not hidden, but it's even more prominently. It's the same name. We should change this. This is the old tool, essentially. This is Simon's warp drive tool. So we should just call this warp drive. But this will open up 3D slicer and a custom build of 3D slicer that Simon created, and gives you the tool of really zooming in, adjusting the contrast and everything. For the sake of this course, though, so we'll go into this, but I also want to show you how you could do it manually, because doing things manually is, if you know how to do that, that gives you better control of your data. So we'll look at warp drive in a second, but we'll also just use the normal 3D slicer or any nifty viewer, but I like 3D slicer because it has a big view and so on, good tools. Now what we can do is we use the T2 and we map that here into space. Open that up, right? And again, this is the GL-ANA T2 in the old lingo, and it would be in the bits example, it would be under normalization, and then there would also be an MNI space and T2 weighted in the end, so that would be the same one. And we'll open that. We'll try to find the STN. It's not an optimal image, by the way. And then the T2 of the MNI space is part of Lead-DBS. So it is in Lead-DBS templates space MNI 152 non-lim 2009 BISIM. And then in here, we'll have the T2 right here. We can load that. That's the T2 template of the MNI space. And then the other thing that is in here that is kind of handy is I think just called Atlas. And that is essentially the distal Atlas segmented. So this is the STN in MNI space, right? So what we can do now here is to open the GL Atlas GL-ANA T2, which is the normalized T2. We can also overlay the Atlas image. Now we can really look at how is the fit. You can go into that Atlas and maybe I don't know, make it red or whatever, and then threshold it and say, okay, we just want to show it where it is, and then we can go into the T2 and then also window this. Again, not a perfect image, but that's exactly perfect for this course, I think, because that is the reality often. We can now look at the fit between the two, right? So now one problem that maybe many of you who are not surgeons or anatomists would probably not even be aware of is that on the axial view, the STN, which we can see here, is sometimes very hard to differentiate from the substantia nigra, which is directly below it, right? So that is a real danger here. This is the nigra, for example. So always if the shadow goes to the anterior limb, anterior border of the peduncles here, that is always nigra. The STN never does that, right? So at this view, if you have a, let's zoom in some more. I'm sorry for the terrible image, but that's reality. If you have such a situation where the dark shadow is, first of all, quite huge, you still see the red nucleus, by the way, but it goes to the anterior, border of this peduncle, then it's never the STN, right? So that means you're too low down. If you would go up some more, now it's harder to tell. It's still nigra, by the way, but it doesn't. We don't have that rule anymore that it borders to something, so it's really hard to tell at the moment. All I can say, it's a bit misshaped, big, and really dark. So that means nigra. And now you have something coming up on top, which is paler, has more the STN shape, and that's the STN, right? So that needs to fit. As you can see here, it doesn't really in the interior part, but it does here quite nicely, I would say. Yeah, going up. Now, it's much easier to differentiate the nigra and the STN on a coronal view. So we can look at that as well. But yeah, terrible data quality. So here it will not be that easy to differentiate it. Check maybe the T2 star is more helpful, but probably not. Of course, also look at that. Oops. And sagittal, coronal view. Okay, it is much better. So let's look at that. So what you want to see here is something like that, there are essentially two bubbles on top of each other and slightly, a bit like this, right? So you have them kind of, one is here, that's the STN, one is here, that's the nigra. And so this pale thing here would be STN. And then this big, dark thing is nigra. And then you can always say, okay, let's make a point here where I say, okay, this is maybe the lower border of the STN for me now. So then now, just roughly at least, on the axial plane, we can see this. So you can go down, 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 down. Yeah, these points now. There's the point. Okay, so that's gonna be helpful. That defines for me. Up from here, we'll see STN. And then up from here, we'll see STN. And then we can, put the atlas on top again. And yeah, again, this is still nigra, really sure about it. Cut here in part. And then the STN is going to be here. Right? So this just giving you the control a bit of knowing where these things are stored and how well they are. What you can also conceive here is in an image quality like that, it would be really hard for you and me to segment the STN, right? If we were to draw where it is, it would be almost impossible. So that two things can be drawn from this. First of all, better imaging quality would be great. Second, probably Lead-DBS is as good as we would be, even in such an image, because it. So my feeling, at least, it's not really bad how it did it. But yeah, of course, if you have better imaging quality, then you can be much more precise and where you really are. The other thing is, of course, what I haven't mentioned but should be quite obvious is you can look at the STN, the M&I space template on top of this as well, not just the atlas. And here you can see beautifully the STN, and then the nigra is this thing again going to the front of the peduncle as well here. So, but the STN is beautifully visible in the M&I space images. It's this pale oval shaped thing. Has the contrast a bit more. Yeah, so red nucleus. And then just to show you, if we compare the distal atlas with the M&I space, the fit of the atlas is really, really beautiful. So that is essentially just a segmentation of these structures. Okay, so but this was the manual way of doing this. Simon's tool gives you a shortcut to directly the scene and even much more. So because we can now even adjust the normalization using his amazing warp drive tool. Right, so this should look familiar. It is based on Slicer, but it and Slicer is also, like, warp drive is also a part of Slicer. You can install it in the normal Slicer tool as well. But for use in Lead-DBS, I think it is actually quite handy to just use the standalone that pops up. And now what do we have here? Same thing. We have the distal atlas, even more beautifully than we had just before. And we have the T2 of the patient normalized already. And we would have the control of also looking at, you know, the other sequences. But for now, let's go with the T2. Okay, and then we can also window it as we did before, just to, you know, make sure we really see the STN as well as possible. Here we go. And these are the segmentations of the distal atlas. We can here add more atlases. So if we, let's say we were looking at epilepsy data or whatever, we can add an atlas, and Simon has created a really neat, you know, import from all of the atlases that you have installed. I have some others installed here, but let's say we also want to see the AHEAD atlas, or for any particular reason, we in our study we really want to focus things on the AHEAD STN, which I wouldn't recommend, by the way, because that's not precisely matching the MNI space which we use to normalize. But you know, we could use that. Then let's delete that again. But we can also sometimes the SID atlas is helpful, which has some more structures around, let's say, also the putamen and so on. So we could look at that. But again, the aim here is to really maximize the fit is to maximize the fit in the STN area, right? So for now, we'll delete the atlas, and we'll just look at that. And now Simon's tool has the capability of directly changing the warp field that maps from the patient space, so the anchor modality space, which is usually the T1, to this MNI space. And that is defined by a warp field. Maybe I should also show that file, so that these files will be these two. They are ANS-based warp fields, GL anode composite and so on. In the bits folder, they would be under normalization and then transformations. So these two, mapping one, you know, from anchor, it's much more logical here, to MNI space, and then the other one from MNI space to anchor native. So yeah, very self-explanatory in the bits world. We can do this now. Let's say we have talked about this rim here before. To be honest, I'm not sure if it's really a mismatch. So, you know, going, sorry, sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes it does make sense to, you know, look at some more slices than just one, because of course it could also be noise, what we're seeing, right? For example, this edge here is, you know, quite salient, that maybe there's really some mismatch here. So I just now unfortunately clicked with the smudge tool, so it's calculating something, but should be done soon. Okay. So the idea here is that we have the power and possibility to refine, you know, this warp, so that the fit between this specific region of the brain in native and MNI space. Okay, something is really with my shift keys off. Okay, so right. Let's assume we want to fix this mismatch now between this small edge and this edge. what we can do is we can draw a line here that would be like that. And what warp drive now does is it finds the nearest points from that line to the next atlas line that is shown. So it really matters which atlas you have visualized here. Really good idea to just use the distal atlas. It finds small, arrows between these points, and it would automatically update the warp field to match that. Right. So now, as you can see, the fit is really nice here, and it does it automatically because there's auto update added here. So if we don't do that, we can make multiple changes and then just calculate it only then. The other way of doing this is with the smudge tool. Sorry that my computer is a bit slow at the moment with Zoom and everything on. Again, I think this is actually a good fit. This is probably not a mismatch here, so it's probably rather a small lesion and a virtual Robin space. But let's assume we are super convinced that the SDN should end here and not here. We could now use the other tool. We could use the drawing, but just to demonstrate it, we could also use the smudge tool to manually smudge or move that warp field around. Right. So as you can see, the computer is slow, but usually it's a bit more fluid. The field is automatically changing. I think it's really an amazing tool. Like basically one can't hype it enough. And will automatically give you an updated view. Now, if we release the mouse, it would calculate these points again. It would first go back, which is sometimes a bit confusing, but then calculate it and then update the view for you. So now you can see these arrows being added kind of to the warp field, and it would calculate the new warp field and then show the image into T2. And I might say some things wrong that are happening under the hood. So if there are questions, do refer them to Simon. He's also on the call. Okay, so but with that, we have full control, as you can see. We just need enough time and skill, but then we have, and of course the images to show the structures, but we have full control to really refine things as much as we want to. And we can sign off by clicking exit. And it would also, by default, harden changes, which means it would really update the warp fields, right? So it is also possible to not harden the change if you, let's say, have a really complicated case where you want to do it in multiple sessions. So that would mean, it would not be applied to the scene. You could reopen it anytime and then, only harden it once you're really done with everything. But as a default, usually in these DBS cases, we can harden the changes. That is now processing, and it means, going back to the patient that I'm just in here, that first of all, there are warp drive data points, which are these fiducials that we added, the drawing lines and so on, and the smudge tool, but then also the GL-ANAT composite and so on a file. So the warp fields will be recomputed at the moment while this is processing. Cool thing is, next time we open it, even though we harden the changes, the points we just created, so it's, say we remember we drew a line that would then be fit to the STN line. These points will now be fixed points, and the computer, like warp drive, remembers that these are a user has taken time to say, okay, these 2 points, should map to each other. Then while this processes, there are quite some, additional things to show here. Currently can't show it because it's busy, but if you go to corrections, that's where you see the list of corrections we made. You could delete the ones that you don't like anymore. For example, you could always, delete everything and calculate, then you're back to 0. You could delete the ones that you made by mistake. And then one thing you have seen is this spread bar, which defines the size of the mouse, let's say, key. And my recommendation is, at least from the experience I have so far, often rather to have use a big smudge, like big spread, and rather try to, let's say, move the whole STN, keep it integer in itself, like keep the local anatomy undistorted, and rather move the whole thing around. So rather work with broad tools and not maybe micromanaging single pixels. That is just so far, this tool is new for everybody as well, but just a gut feeling that this is the best way to do things. And I haven't shown the point-to-point tool. So I would say most of this is quite self-explanatory, and then there are some, more parameters like stiffness and so on that all add to this problem that, we of course could tell the computer this pixel goes to this pixel, but it would always ask, but what about the neighboring pixels, right? How many of the neighboring pixels should I take with me, and how strongly do you want me to take them with me? So this is a bit like essentially see it as a Gaussian blur or a Gaussian function of things, although under the hood it is, I think, implemented differently. The other thing is you can also here switch between template and normalized T2. So this is what we've just done in 3D Slicer, with this fader here between the two that I've shown you before. And then you can also, of course, this is the axial view, this is the coronal, this is the sagittal view by default. What else is there? You can, of course, switch modalities and so on. And then, yeah, segments, I think we don't have to go into. Atlases are helpful. And yeah, that's that. Okay, so, all right, so with that, we are at a point, finally, it's been long, a lot of information, where we could also then sign off normalization, right? We have looked at different ways. There was the small refined atlas fit tools, essentially the old warp drive. There's the new warp drive. I've shown you 3D Slicer, and I've also shown the detail viewer and so on. So multiple ways to make sure this precision between STN and STN model is correct. So now we'll sign off of that. And what I would propose is that we do 5 minutes break, and then do the rest, which would also go a bit more into localizing electrodes, and finally in the end looking at, is what we see really correct? Any urgent questions so far, or should we just make that small break now? Right, so thanks for your attention. We'll have a 5 minutes break. So let's meet at 11:20 in Boston, and I guess 4:20 in Berlin. Everything clear? Don't be shy. We're just a few people. There's questions, please fire away.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is from a while ago, but could you just quickly go back to when you were manually aligning the ANA T1 and T2 in 3D Slicer?
So I think you mean this part, right?
Yeah. I just forgot what you clicked at the beginning.
Okay, so yeah, so good point. So to open up this viewer, you just click on the check results. If you would run it without this retouch thing, it would not show you anything, and the reason is that you already approved everything, right? So let's assume we did approve everything, but the T2, right? We disapproved the T2. Now, if we run it now with the retouch thing, it would only show us that, because and afterwards it would be done. And the reason, so this can be helpful if you, let's say you process 20 patients in a batch, right? You load them in here. that's another thing that some of you might even not know, that you can select multiple patients here. You can just select 2 or more. And then let's say you run these 3 things in a go, press run maybe overnight or so. Now you could, and sorry, I only have one example here, but you could now use this to your advantage in that you would not set it, and then everything that you approve will not be touched anymore. So that means, let's say you approve a co-registration, that's going to be fixed, won't be touched anymore. If you approve a normalization, it's going to be fixed, and so on. And then if you rerun for all the patients co-registration and normalization, but maybe with different setting, let's say you use ANTS or you use whatever, then without this thing, it would only do it for the stuff that wasn't approved yet. So that can be helpful if you batch process 20 patients or 50 patients to keep control over, what I approve, Lead-DBS is not going to touch anymore, no matter what I do, except if I, put this thing on. So again, so I think in a single use case, if you just have one patient selected, just keep it on always, because then usually, you want to see what you want to see. And then I think if you have multiple patients and you want to work with the approval and disapproval of stuff, then, it might make sense to keep this off. Okay, so that's great. So now we are kind of, we have checked off of the block 3, which is called volume registrations. And that is already a big chunk. The only other chunk is block 5, and then the rest is just visualization. So already, we've done a lot. We've come really far. The surface reconstruction here could, should even go out. You wouldn't use it. It's not functioning. We're working on that now slowly again, also with the Neumann lab and the Paul lab, potentially to add some sort of surface reconstruction in there. But essentially at the moment, there's never a reason to do this. So it says optional, but, just ignore it. So we move on to these 2, and we've already run pre-reconstruct. Remember that the 3 green things are the ones we want to check if something's already readily processed and, a friend gave it to us, or we just don't know anymore, is this all correct, and so on. So these are the manual input steps that Lead-DBS has. The rest is automatic. So if we press run here, you all know this view. It shows us the electrode artifact. So in this case, it's the postoperative CT, as we've seen, and it shows us the electrode here. And that model on this left side is a Boston Scientific Versailles directed model. Why? Because we selected it here, right? It didn't detect that. We had to set it. If we would go to, let's say, Medtronic 3389 now, it would think, oh, all of a sudden it's a different electrode and it's a different model here. It only has 4 contacts, it doesn't have the markers and so on, right? But I know this patient is a Boston Scientific Versailles directed one, so it makes sense to set that as well, right? So this is also the way how you change the model that's stored, right? So this view here is together with the normalization really where the money is, right? I said normalization is where the money is. This is the second thing where the money is. And with the money is, I mean, these things really matter. This is where you can screw up and then, run 20 patients and you just don't find what you think you should be seeing. For example, overlaps with the STN stimulation should, of course, code for improvements in Parkinson's disease. If you screw up these 2 points, that won't work, right? And the electrode position will be, not usable. So these 2 things, normalization, that includes also warp drive, so the refinement of the normalization, and then this part, that's where the money is. This view is really old. It's about the oldest part that Lead-DBS has, and that's also why it is kind of finicky and not optimal. So if anybody in the crowd wants to redo a better way of doing this, please, talk to us. We'd love that. So it's really old school. That being said, I think once you know how it works, it is actually quite neat. So I built it for me back in the day because, you know, I was the only user, and I built it in a way that I like to work with it. So it doesn't use the mouse at all. It really uses the keyboard. And as you all know, we can, you know, change with the arrow keys the electrode markers relative to the artifact. These markers inside of Lead-DBS we call head and tail. Head, think of it as a, you know, the head of the electrode, and then the tail. They can be different at different locations in different electrode models, but usually they are in the center of the bottommost contact, it's the head, and the center of the top contact is the tail. For example, in the Boston Scientific Versailles non-directed lead, which has 8 contacts as well, but they are all in one order. There, you know, we have 4 more contacts going up here, so the tail will be the 4th contact, not in the 8th contact. So they are just defined. They are relative markers relative to the electrode model, and often they try to span these, you know, 2 millimeters times 3 between in most electrodes, but they are defined by Lead-DBS. They are not official definitions, and these 2 markers really define where things are, right? So you can see here, it's hard to see as well, but there are even 3 contacts. These are the segmented contacts on this line as well. But what really matters is these 2, right? And now we can, as you know, move things around with, and we should, with the arrow keys up and down, moving the markers relative to the artifact. And we call them markers, but this should not be confused with this marker here, which is the electrode marker for the directionality. So we have called them markers even before directional electrodes existed. So these are the Lead-DBS markers. There's one button that you might not know, which is called X, so the X-ray mode. If you press X or you click on this goggles up here, you would, what Lead-DBS tries to do is to intersect neighboring slices to enhance the contrast to some degree. So that just flickering between the 2 can sometimes be helpful. And in this Versailles directed electrode, you can see this directionality marker, which is not a contact, so that's up here, which is essentially currently not important. The contacts are really these 8 down here. Now and then, you also probably all of you know that, if you select 0 or press this button, you activate the head marker, and then you can also see it in the axial view. You can move that around now. So it's now the arrow keys really don't move the electrode in the Z direction, but rather move it around in the X plane. So that is helpful to adjust things in that direction, and then the same goes for 3. We can select the tail, and then we can move that around as well. So the goal here is to make all of the 3 views. So this is anterior, left view, and then dorsal view. All of them fit. So for example, here you could say now at the moment the dorsal view doesn't fit, right? The reason could be that it's cut like this, and as you can see here, there's some sort of interpolation issue, just because the CT has a thicker slice thickness, that this looks misplaced on the axial view, but is still kind of optimally placed in this view. So there is no, depending on the image modality, there is no single view where you can say, oh, this is the gold standard, this has to be in the middle here, but you have to integrate in your head kind of the optimal agreement between the 3 views. X sometimes helps, here it doesn't help, but yeah, it does help in the axial view, because here it would again interpolate across the neighboring slices, so it would add some sort of more robust along the line of the electrode. So yeah. And this can be really finicky. Again, for the more new users, you would usually get the hang of it quite fast if you just do more. Let's get to your question in a second, Lauren. But you know, the more you look at things, the better, and you'll get the hang of how to operate with this. Still, I totally agree. It would be better to have some sort of you know, easier to use interface here as well. Okay, so now one thing that might be not known to some of you as well, that are beginners, is the directionality detection, because it's really hidden here. So we did a terrible job of adding this into the GUI. This only applies to directed electrodes like this one. And the directionality really means how the electrode is spinned or oriented in its own axis, right? So this wouldn't matter in a conventional electrode, because we will always have a ring electrode, which, you know, the rotation of it is just not important at all. But with the segmented electrodes that look like this, that have 3 segments often at each, you know, contact level, it really does matter, because we want to steer the current in the XY, like in the XY plane as well. So that sits up here, and you really have to click that auto button. So we will have to refine the UI here to make this more salient. But that would open up DOD version 2 by now, which is really cool work by Till Dembeck in Cologne. And I think, unfortunately, DOD has a small bug at the moment, but soon to be fixed. But what we see here, I can still explain to you what DOD does. So the idea of this is that we cut the CT in at level of the marker, so at that level, or also that level here, and we look at so the marker, you know, has essentially this one small metal part here, which would lead to a shadow or a hyperdensity along that line, right? So the white line would mean where the marker looks at, right? So this is really where the X-rays go through and give you a high contrast thing. And so and this line here means represents this small green ring that you might see here. So it starts, I think, at this point. So this is that, and then it goes in clockwise direction to this point, which is here, and then it goes back there. And what you can see in blue is the actual intensity. So white being, you know, again, this one is white, so it's a high intensity, and then this one is also white, it's also high intensity, but then these two will be the values. And it just tries to fit this red curve, which is a model of what is expected, to that line, and that will you know, say, like, let us know how the thing is oriented. It has a second level and even like a third level. So these 2 levels are usually combined here in DOD version 2, where these segmented electrodes contacts can give us some more insights. And here you can usually see this black A formation or like a star formation. So 3 black, you know, thin shadows, and these are where the X-rays can, you know, enter in this small thing and then also exit in the other small thing, or, you know, there are 3, so it would give you this star formation. So these are really where the light can pass through. So there's hypodensity. And it now has this intensity profile here again. So this is now going around around what we see in a bigger circle. This is a smaller circle, and it would try to fit or find the valleys in this, and would also show you the valleys on that curve. And it then tries to, you know, also with that look at the you know, how the rays are being cut essentially. So if the electrode is really you know, not orthogonal to the rays, which is never is, like has an angle, would try to match that and even correct this direction level shift. Okay, so this looks great, right? We could say, okay, wow, this is super. The problem is now that 180-degree flip is sometimes really hard to resolve. So in the old diode, it wasn't even, possible to resolve it. And then the new one, Till and colleagues claim they have resolved it, but yeah, I would still be kind of careful. There are often two solutions to the problem. So you could easily imagine that the electrode could also, instead of facing to the back here, face to the front. And the normal convention that most surgeons use is they try to put the electrode with the marker to the anterior to the nose of the patient, right? So the markers usually are intended to, project to the front. Wouldn't hurt to ask your surgeon if they do it the same way, right? If she or he has a different system, you should know, right? But and that's the official guideline from Boston Scientific and so on, try to put the markers to the front. That means that this is anterior here, that kind of, this solution is more likely. It is more likely that the surgeon, that the electrode, turned a little bit. It is a bit less likely that it turned by nearly 180 degrees, right? So it could be that DOD now gives us a completely wrong thing. So we really want to I would do it that way at least, but talk to your surgeon as well, how confident are they that they should turn anteriorly? I would rather prefer this option. And the only way to do that is to look at the manual refine. And I think, unfortunately, that's a little bit broken, but I can still show you everything, how you would usually do it. So manual refine just gives you some more ways to interact with the diode. And the first thing is that you can, look at the slice 0, which is usually estimated at the middle of this, but maybe, some slice around it has a better contrast. And again, now you need to know what you're looking for. You need to know you're looking for this kind of white line, right? And I would say you see that quite nicely on all of them. So let's just take slice 0. Then it asks you to double click in the center of it. So let's do that. And now it tries to interpolate between these two levels. And now you're looking for this A formation or star formation, right? So you can have a look at, our images aren't that good anyways in Berlin for that. I think there's some metal artifact compression that they do, but sometimes it's much clearer, so you can check with your own. But here again, I would say there's none of them that is much better than the slice 0, so let's just use that. Ask you again, double click in the middle, already has it quite nicely. But even if that's all it helps you with, now it would usually give you the option to say, you want to use solution 1, which is 32 degrees, or solution 2, which is, I think in this case, this one, which would be, minus 147 degree. And I would usually use the one with the lower number, right? 0 would be anterior, and the deviation is just more likely to be smaller than really much bigger, right? So I would personally use that, but to be honest, we can't be 100% sure. And this is where the DOD is broken at the moment. We fix that. So that would be the process. Usually you click this and then, it would fix things. Okay, so for now we just say accept and save, but remember we are kind of, we have it 180 degree turned in this case. Yeah. And then you go to the second electrode by pressing space or pressing this accept button, and then you do the same thing, right? You fill it around, you want to localize it as precisely as you can. You can press X and so on. You can select the anchors, so the, not the anchors, the markers, and turn it around. And then you also look into DOD again. You look at the directionality, and hopefully the bug I just showed you is fixed quite soon. And yeah, so here this is more like anticipated, right? So anterior, nearly anterior, so slide rotation here. You see a beautiful fit between the model and the data. And you also see a beautiful fit of the A star here. And then you just say accept and save, you're done. So on the left, so second electrode, which is always the left electrode in Lead-DBS, it is correct, the directionality detection, and in the other one, we would have manually refined it. Then you press space again. Now it's being saved. You can also see the EA reconstruction file has been updated right now. That's where the localization is stored. And then in bits, that would be inside of reconstruction, right? So this file, likely to be changed to a JSON sooner or later, but at the moment, I think it's still a MAT file. Okay. Questions up to here. Sorry, I'll also look at what Lauren wrote. Do you have another question, Lauren? Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Essentially, what I'm reading is Lauren, you're not yet totally familiar anatomically to be sure things are correct. And that's totally fine. That we all need to essentially study the anatomy to get there. So, and that's a process. So you really have to see optimally 100 images before you're a real expert, I think, and just be curious and stay with that, and then always, like for the folks here that do some research project, always ask yourself, is the research question that I'm asking, is my skill set good enough for that? If you would ask the question like a subfield analysis of the SDN with gait improvement, then you should really know what you're doing anatomy-wise, right? If it's more like, in general, does it matter whether we're close to the SDN or not? That's a very loose scientific question. Then, of course, you could probably do that, right? So what I'm trying to convey here is, we can't really solve for you. We can make everything completely bulletproof and foolproof, but we can give you the tools and the necessary skills you can then develop to answer your research questions. Okay, so great. So nearly time to wrap up, but now we've done this, we've localized everything. So we've registered everything, we've localized everything. Now the nice thing is we can just visualize things. We can choose the atlas we want to look at. Let's just use the distal nano. By default, it would show it in MNI space, but we could easily just visualize everything in native space as well. And we can look at it in 2D whiteouts, maybe just briefly show you that as well. That would, oops. Wait. This is an old setting, because I said to choose the backdrop, we can just say T2 is the backdrop. And then, just to show you that as well, this would export images where you see, in 2D. These are often more informative than the 3D view, where exactly each contact is relative to the SDN in an axial view and so on. Would also export these right now here as image files, which you can then flick through. And, these are the segmented electrodes, so they are on the same level and so on. So this is sometimes really helpful. Never underestimate the 2D view. They're sometimes really helpful, and it would export it, also then in coronal views and so on. So can be really helpful as well. Yeah. Still gonna shut this down now to go to the 3D viewer. Just stopped. And that will open what we call ELVIS, the electrode visualization viewer, which of course is the main viewer that you've all seen and used and so on. But what I'm now, as the last thing, I'm gonna show you a bit is usually this part is where people ask me, okay, my electrode is outside of the SDN, is that correct or not, right? So in this case, it is beautifully. It's even a really nice placement. This is our example subject from the Lead-DBS courses as well that we use. So it's a perfect placement. This is the sweet spot up here in the rim, I think, and then here as well. Maybe a little bit anterior, but minimally. I think beautiful placement here. But let's assume for a second that this electrode would just be really outside of the STN, right? That's exactly for beginners often the big question. Imagine it's the first patient you localized. Is this now true? How can I know? Did I screw up? Or did kind of the surgeon screw up? Or, I mean, this happens to all the best surgeons in the world. So they, wouldn't say screw up. So I've seen really electrodes from many of the best surgeons in the world. And if you look at 50 of these, some would be outside. So that happens, even the best center. So, but the question is, is this a problem of the reconstruction in Lead-DBS that it's off, or is it really off? And I would say short answer, if you're really an expert and you check all of these three as meticulously if we've just done, and it's off, then it's off. Right? You can be quite sure then it's off. But, as Lauren just pointed out, it's sometimes hard to say, is that really precise? You haven't gotten all the experience and haven't seen that many data points. Sometimes the imaging isn't as clear and so on. So it's going to be much harder to say, yes, I'm confident this is really true. And I guess it boils down to, in the end, sometimes you really just don't know, especially if the imaging is crappy. But what we want to do now is to, again, go back to 3D Slicer and open up the base files to confirm what we're seeing here. Right? So we take, in this case, the ANA T2. ANA T2 that we want to see. And then we take the R post-op CT. And these would, in bids, again, much more logical, which would be the co-registration files. So the T2 here and the CT here, right? So these two, same folder, same space. But in our case, these two are the ones. And now we can overlay them again, just as we've done before. Maybe you remember. And they should, of course, the co-registration should still be as precise as possible. But what we can also do is we go into volumes. We select the post-op CT. And let's give it some color by clicking on this button. Then we can threshold it. And remember, the R post-op CT would be on top here. The T2 would be on the bottom. So we can threshold it, and all the pixels that are below a certain threshold we just not visualize. Right? So we can really threshold only the metal parts of this. Right? And now we can zoom in and really focus on this. One thing we can do is using markups, we can use a ruler where we can just measure how much distance between these 2 points do we have? Because this is 1.9 millimeters already, but the electrode only is 1.24 millimeters long, right? So we know this is already overestimating the electrode. It's thicker than the electrode is. And we can maybe fix that further by even thresholding it higher, and then comparing, we want something like 1.24, but that's, overdoing it. I'm just, this is really just teaching. So usually you don't have to be as drastic as I'm now doing it. It does matter though, if you look at postoperative MRIs, they really overshoot. They give you sometimes an artifact of 2 millimeters thickness. So just make sure that that this is really overshooting what we see. But so this is kind of correct now, I would say. So this is roughly the thickness of the electrode. And can now again go to the T2 only and window it as harshly as we can, and then go to the CT. And one thing at least that we can say is that it is nicely placed within the SDN. Now remember, the question often arises not in this situation where everything is good, because it is kind of less likely to be in the SDN by accident, right? If you screwed up, you often screw up in a way that, you know, the electrode would be misplaced, so sometimes really outside of everything. But let's assume it's really at the border of it, or it's really like close by the SDN, but not really inside of it. If you now saw this, the SDN and the electrode, you knew you'd probably screwed up, right? Because the real data doesn't match the reconstruction. Here as well, this is the medial border of the SDN, this is the red nucleus. So the anterior line of the red nucleus sometimes is a good rough estimate of where to put the electrode for the surgeons as well. So this is nicely placed within the SDN. This here is probably the lateral wall. Again, really hard to differentiate from the nigra, which goes again to the anterior border. I think we're also not in axial view here. So this is now axial. So we see on both sides, it's really nicely placed. We could, you know, think, okay, this is maybe the posterior border of the SDN, and we are now on the left side of the image. You can always see that here. So if you with your mouse, so the left side of the image, even though it's the right side, so slice as a radiological view. So the left electrode is maybe a bit more posterior than the anterior if you just measure the distance between this in your head, the posterior border of the SDN here, then here. So left should be more posterior. Let's see if that is true in our reconstruction as well. And it kind of is, right? So yeah, don't know if it's clear to see, but sorry, let me switch off that. So yeah, so this is, oh wait, no, it's not true. So left is more posterior, left is more anterior here. Okay, so then the question is why? Could of course be that I've just selected a slice, or it could really be that the reconstruction is off. The other hand, yeah, here it looks even like the posterior border of the SDN is more like there. But that's exactly the, the process. Yeah, so probably the SDN stops here, not here. But it could be that this is exactly a mismatch that I've just found where this doesn't match. So the slicer native view doesn't match what we see in Lead-DBS, and that is exactly the way how you could check, right? So if your electrode in the view would be outside, let's say lateral on the left side, then you would want to see that here as well. And this spot should be here, lateral on the sorry, it's right side. On the left side, lateral should be here, so it should be misplaced here as well. And I guess this is the main way to check this. The only point now is, unfortunately, this view is not brain shift corrected, while this view is. So there could be a slight mismatch between the two that is explained by the brain shift correction. So especially if your brain shift correction transform was large, meaning there was a lot of brain shift, and the brain shift tool did a lot, this is not seen here, because the R post of CT and the ANA T2 are the non-brain shift corrected views. So it could even be that this is more true than this, because here we don't have a brain shift correction. So if you have a case where brain shift correction has been huge and there is some misplacement and you're not sure, then unfortunately this can only give you some estimate. You could go back now into brain shift correction, check at that, and then look at what the matrix did. So going to that, and then that could even help you a bit further. But I would say the optimal case is that brain shift correction didn't even have to do much, and then you can more or less directly compare the two views. And we'll come up with a good way to include the brain shift correction in this view as well. But here you can see, so what brain shift correction did was minus 4.1 millimeters to probably the left, then 1 millimeter anterior and 1.2 millimeters up. So the CT was shifted up. So it's around, 1 millimeter that in most directions that could be explained by brain shift correction. So let's say if exactly maybe this situation where we think, oh yeah, there is some mismatch between the asymmetry that we have here, and we measure that, say, from here to here, this 1 millimeter of tolerance is could be explained by brain shift. And yeah, we should have a better way of integrating the brain shift transform into the R-post CT as well. So then we could be exactly sure, these two things should match up precisely. Okay, so this was now certainly complicated stuff, but it's exactly the stuff that people ask me all the time. So meaning, I've localized, and usually this is what the beginners ask, right? So and then sometimes really hard for me to give them good advice because everything's quite complicated. But if you find that the electrode is misplaced, two options could be, it could be true, it could be that you screwed up. And the more you know about what we've done today, the better, or the more sure you can be that you didn't screw up, but it's really misplaced, right? And maybe as a final word of caution before we stop, this should also show you that, if you use Lead-DBS for any clinical decision making, again, it shouldn't be used for clinical. It's not made for that, right? There are FDA approved solutions for that, but some people tend to still inform themselves with that. That should only be done if you really know what you're doing, and even then probably not, right? So in a research context it's different and so on, but yeah, and it also goes for science. Not, if we don't think about clinical decisions at all, you've probably learned in this course that you really should be a pro before you take these results and really use them for scientific research as well. So what I tell people that learn it in my lab usually is really to take 2 months or so to dabble around with it and really understand exactly what happens there, because unlike in any other imaging domain, millimeters really matter so much here. The electrode, so the localization would be useless if it has a 5 millimeter error, right? Because then it could be all over the place. So it's really about being as precise as possible. And the only way we can do that is really by what I just did the last 2 hours, right? So looking at the data, diving into it, really understanding what's happening and so on. Because everybody can create these beautiful pictures now with Lead-DBS, but they're not helpful if they just don't represent reality. With that, it's noon here. I'm around for questions, but of course feel free to sign off. But happy to take questions. And the aim is to repeat this every 6 months, also for my lab, but then for everybody interested, to kind of as a refresher of things, because things also change all the time. Yeah, questions, thoughts? Was this helpful? Was this just confusing?
Just as a comment, Annie, this was amazing. Thank you so much. Really, I learned so much. And a few things also that you took up along the way yourself, but then never had to check, oh, is this the correct way of doing it? And now you just laid out the cookbook of how to do it. So it's great, really great. Thank you. I have one question. What if you don't have preoperative imaging, but you do have a good postoperative MRI, which is taken 1 month after surgery? What special things should you then do? Because I have that kind of data.
Yeah, great question. So question for everybody was case we only have a good post-operative image, no preoperative image. So first of all, I think it's suboptimal. It's always better to have preoperative imaging because the post-operative will be, of course, limited by how long you can scan and so on with the metal in the brain. But I would say it can be done. It should be done by pros like you, Fred. So not by maybe beginners. But one thing I tend to recommend then is to use. Obviously, you'd do something like let's say this is our post-op only subject. So we don't have all of these. We just have, let's say, and this is now an MRI. We just have that. So we would duplicate it and just call it also T2 often. It's often a T2, but maybe it's a T1. So that would be the situation then to start. Maybe you have more than, you also have a coronal image and an axial and a sagittal image. So that could be a situation. You have several post-op images. You would duplicate one of that as the preoperative image and call it ANAT, whatever it is, T1 or T2, or if you have more than that, you can also duplicate more of them. And call them maybe ANAT T11, ANAT T12, or ANAT T22, and so on. And that with bits is a bit different, of course. But yeah, same idea. And then you would run co-registration and you run normalization. But with normalization, we have this old 3-step affine normalization using ANS tool. And what that does is that it doesn't do a nonlinear registration, but it runs a linear registration in 3 consecutive steps. It's a bit like brain shift correction. So that's where these masks come from, where the first one would be linear on the whole brain, second would be linear on just the subcortex, and the third would even be linear just on the basal ganglia. So it wouldn't apply as greatly to let's say depression with CG25, that there we just don't have these masks. But I think yeah, normalization on here you can even try that. I haven't used that in a long time. But yeah, so the idea would be it would still create a warp, but in linear one. And the advantage of that could be that the electrode is not moved relatively to the tissue, because obviously you don't want that. You want to keep the integrity between the electrode and the local tissue, the SDN around of it. And if you use a linear transform, that's going to work. And you could, I think I've never tried, but you could usually still use warp drive afterwards, because it would produce a, Simon, correct me if I'm wrong, but it should also produce a normal ANS output file because it's based on ANS, and then probably warp drive should also work. So then you could, and then again, use a big smudge tool, because you want to keep the local integrity of the electrode and the SDN intact, but you can then slightly, still move the SDN to the right place. So that's probably what I would try to do. If you would do the normal, ANS nonlinear, you run the risk that ANS thinks, and of course it doesn't think, but it would think that the electrode should go this way, but the SDN should go this way, right? And then it would, displace stuff, and then the whole thing gets not useful anymore. It usually wouldn't do that because we have already penalized these so-called high frequency deformations in the warp fields, or high frequency components in the warp fields, because we use in the standard ANS setting, we use this effective low variance setting, which does penalize it quite a bit to not do exactly what I just said, move the electrode here and move the electrode, the rest there. If you would go to high variance, that would really run the risk of doing that, right? I would certainly not do that. But this being said, so my first step would be try with Schönecker. So with this 3-step method, if the normalization is good enough with warp drive, it looks like perfect fit, perfect. If not, you can also try the normal ants, but then just be much more cautious. If there's any like swirling around the electrode where it feels like it, it's bended it around, that is really not what you want to see. I don't know if that helps.
Perfect, thank you. That's so helpful.
Other questions or thoughts? And also thanks from my side for your interest. I mean, this was really long now, and not everybody made it till the end, but that was expected, and I'll have the recording online. Yeah, it is precision neuroimaging what we do, and that's why sometimes things are kind of complicated. A lot of people that enter the field want to automatize this process completely, and I hope I could convince you that I don't think that's a good idea. It might be for the n equals 1,000 studies that we have just learned on Twitter are now the big hype again. But it might not be good for the lower n things.
I do have a second question if nobody else wants to.
Sure.
So I work a lot with epilepsy subjects, and they either have big brain lesions or genetic abnormalities. So that highly distorts the brain and makes the fit to MNI, of course, difficult. How do you deal with those? And I bet it's like a playing game of trying to maximize it around the target region, but how do you challenge those?
Yeah, great question. So lesions in the brains, in pre-op brains, I would say same answer. Optimally, use the linear approach. If that gives you a decent enough registration, that's great. Because again, you would run the risk that it thinks the lesion is something that should go that way, and the rest of around the lesion should go that way, right? So it would, if you have a nonlinear registration, that might be a problem to and then the other thing is the whole lesion, like normalizing lesion brains, is of course a field in itself where the ANTS team, for example, has done great work, but other people have done that as well. So where of course you could mask the lesions, right? So you could really take the normalization a bit outside of Lead-DBS and use whatever people have come up with, masking the lesions or so. I would still think though, if it is a normal target, and that includes also the thalamus for epilepsy, then this 3-step approach could give you a great result in many of them. And then you still have warp drive to, with a big tool, slightly move things around. So, the registration could still be as good as the human eye or your eye. So I would probably start with that. So exactly the same answer to the postoperative only question, I think.
Great, thank you.
Cool. Then, yeah, have a good night in Berlin and lunch in Boston. Thanks for your attention, and I hope this was helpful. So,
thanks again. Thanks, Annie.
yeah, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.